time to look at some actual lyrical ballads and see what Wordsworth is doing. To start off, some lines from The Thorn, which is a poem about local history, how this thorny bush came to occupy a particular part of the landscape, the people and the incidents associated with it. You'll notice that the narrator gives a great deal of space to setting the scene. Far, far too much space to setting the scene. And that's an important observation I'm going to come back to. In opening stanzas, we readers become intimately acquainted with the appearance of the bush and its immediate surroundings. This time I've enlisted Robin Gerster, my colleague, to read some of them.
High on a mountain's highest ridge, where oft the stormy winter gale cuts like a scythe, while through the clouds it sweeps from vale to vale. Not 5 yards from the mountain path, this thorn you on your left espy, and to the left 3 yards beyond, you see a little muddy pond of water, never dry. I've measured it from side to side. 'Tis 3 foot long and 2 feet wide. And close beside this aged thorn, there is a fresh and lovely sight, a beauteous heap, a hill of moss, just 1/2 foot in height. All lovely colours, there you see, all colours that were ever seen. And mossy network too is there, as if by hand of lady fair the work had woven been. And cups, the darlings of the eye, so deep is their vermilion dye.
This has been called some of the worst poetry ever written. In his great critical work, Biographia Literaria, Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes, and I'm quoting here, that these lines are felt by many unprejudiced and unsophisticated hearts as unpleasant sinkings from the height to which the poet had previously lifted them. The word sinkings there, as though to say that Wordsworth is simply off form, delivering something below his usual standard. It's important to note that Biographia Literaria was published in 1817, so Coleridge was looking back in time to his most fruitful period of friendship with Wordsworth in 1797 and 1798. William Hazlitt also complains of too much information in the poem. He writes, quote, "An old withered thorn is weighed down with a heap of recollections." Habitually, Hazlitt continues, Wordsworth's mind magnifies the littleness of its subject, as though what Wordsworth is writing about isn't worthy of a poem. Much more recently, an American critic named Hazard Azens has referred to the thorn as, I quote, "a dragon's treasure trove of badness." Readers have complained in particular about the description of the muddy pond of water never dry, which sounds as though Wordsworth is telling us that water is never dry. And in particular too, people have seized upon the couplet, "I've measured it from side to side, 'tis 3 feet long and 2 feet wide," which sounds like an awful excess of detail. Hurt by Coleridge's criticism, Wordsworth removed these lines from a revised version of The Thorn. Doing this implies that Coleridge was right about the sinkings, and lent support to anyone who complained about the original version of the poem. But was Wordsworth doing something deliberate that corresponds to his overall goal about new uses of the ballad form? We need to interpret the poem in light of Wordsworth's critical ideas about rustic life and the real language of men. First off, a few comments on the ballad form. The long stanzas in The Thorn are actually based on the ballad form, the ballad traditionally having a 4-line stanza. In The Thorn, it's just 2 ballad stanzas stuck together, with an extra line in the second part, which has the effect of speeding up the reading, and a rhyming couplet added at each end. For an example, look at the 5th stanza. Another thing we know about ballads is that traditionally they have to have a plot, and finally, at last, 50 lines into the poem, there's a hint of intrigue, this intimation of the death of an infant, and the speaker elaborates. I couldn't force Robin to read any more poetry, so I'll have to read some of the lines myself. For oft there sits between the heap that's like an infant's grave in size, and that same pond of which I spoke, a woman in a scarlet cloak, and to herself she cries, O misery, O woe is me, O misery. And finally we appear to have a ballad on our hands, a story. There's a sorrowful and mysterious tale at hand. The traditional language of the ballad is forcibly employed in the cliched, oh woe is me, oh misery, which is terrible, hackneyed kind of language. Nobody could claim that is high poetry. As readers, we wait for the story to progress, and the device Wordsworth introduces from the 8th stanza is conversation. We realise that there's a dialogue happening, we realise that the person narrating the ballad is being questioned by someone else, who we infer is a newcomer to the area. The visitor asks what has happened. Wants to know why Martha Ray keeps going up to the hill and crying, "Woe is me, oh misery," and why is there a mysterious ditch that looks like it's the size of an infant's grave. We're told that she allegedly gave her company, as the phrase goes, to a man named Stephen Hill. She was devastated to discover that Stephen Hill was already married to another woman. Poor Martha, Wordsworth says, on that woeful day a cruel, cruel fire, they say, into her bones was sent. It dried her body like a cinder and almost turned her brain to tinder. So the reader wants to know exactly what happened to Martha Ray, but a kind of fault has appeared in the narrative with that uncertain phrase, they say. A cruel fire was sent into her bones, they say. And the phrase recurs in the following stanza. The poem ceases functioning as a ballad because nobody actually knows what happened to Martha Ray. 'Tis said a child was in her womb, we're told. Old Father Simpson did maintain that Martha Ray bore a child who brought her back to her senses. But the narrator concedes, I quote, "If a child was born or no, there's no one that could ever tell." A grisly suggestion of infanticide has caught the attention of the newcomer and captured our attention as readers. Now the speaker is telling us lamely he's not sure whether there was a murder or even a child, but there is a depressed woman seen out of doors from time to time. The visitor is the speaker's audience, and as such, the visitor represents us, the audience that reads the book. This person, like us, grows increasingly impatient with the would-be storyteller who clearly doesn't have a story to tell. The speaker tells us that he carries a telescope around with him everywhere. Wordsworth explains that this is a retired sea captain. Clearly he has a lot of time on his hands. This is significant. Ultimately, the poem reveals more of the main narrator's mindset than it does of Martha Ray. It's a kind of psychological study of someone who is desperate to retain the attention of his listener, even after admitting he has nothing to tell. We learn a lot about this narrator over the course of the poem, and about this local atmosphere of gossip and unkind speculation. To get an idea what Wordsworth is up to here, I want to bring in a comparable example from another poem, Simon Lee, the Old Huntsman, this time read by my boss, Kevin Foster, who has the requisite North of England accent.
My gentle reader, I perceive how patiently you've waited, and I'm afraid that you expect some tale will be related. O reader, had you in your mind such stories as silent thought can bring? O gentle reader, you would find a tale in everything. What more I have to say is short. I hope you'll kindly take it. It is no tale, but should you think perhaps a tale, you'll make it.
Likewise, we're frustrated in The Thorn every time the main speaker says something like, "I cannot tell," or "some will say." It increases our doubt that anyone in the poem has anything concrete to say at all. So The Thorn disappoints our expectations of a ballad by not giving us a story. But the further The Thorn progresses, the more we realise that Wordsworth's point is not to do with what happened to Martha Ray, it's to do with the mentality of the other people in the poem. If all of that made The Thorn sound like a kind of psychology essay, we could say something very similar about We Are Seven. In this case, we know that the poem is based on an actual encounter Wordsworth had when he met a small girl, much as he describes in the poem. We Are Seven is the dialogue between Wordsworth and this young girl, and their conversation illuminates the contrast between the child's perspective on death and the poet's. And this contrast encapsulates the ways that Wordsworth and Coleridge theorised different levels of consciousness. The question of knowing is again central to We Are Seven, as the poet attempts to force knowledge onto the girl, insisting on the fact of death. He learns that she has a fundamentally different perception of absence and presence, and she considers no practical separation between life and death. The girl then is another figure who resists the kind of poem we expect. Her beauty may be glad, the poet says, and he uses idyllic language to describe the child. Her hair was thick with many a curl, and she had a rustic woodland air. The poet begins by questioning her in rather a condescending fashion, but he becomes puzzled. We Are Seven is set up for the girl to provide a gentle narrative of rural life, but the poet is shocked to encounter instead philosophical frustration as he reaches an impasse, arguing with the child over her deceased relatives. The poet objects to the fact that the little girl counts her two dead siblings as living presences alongside her surviving family. He attempts to correct her and fails. The girl argues with the poet by reference to evidence that her dead brother and sister remain tangible to her. Their graves are green, they may be seen, the little maid replied. So their perspectives are utterly incompatible. The child allows agency to her brother and sister, saying, "Two of us in the churchyard lie." The poet tries to reformulate this as a passive construct, appropriate to positioning a corpse. He says, "Two are in the churchyard laid," and he doesn't recognise the girl's inclusive use of the word us. The child's argument proceeds on the grounds that she interacts with her deceased brother and sister as physical presences. And she has the tone of someone explaining matters to quite a stupid person. John and Jane are side by side, as though choosing to keep each other's company. Concluding, we might wonder how We Are Seven squares with the ideas about poetry in Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads. He's used the ballad verse form again, and he's lured us into thinking that we're reading a traditional ballad that is going to tell us a tale. He has employed the real language of men, as he puts it. And like the thorn, We Are Seven coaxes us towards deeper issues than we expected on reading the first lines, away from incident and towards considerations of consciousness and the imagination.